Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Gifted Adult, a revolutionary guide for liberating everyday genius, by Mary-Elaine Jacobsen, PsyD. Narrated by Rosemary, Benson. Publisher's note. This audiobook refers to diagrams, charts, tests, and scores included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Part 1. Identifying Everyday Genius. 1. Beyond Giftedness. Everyday Genius Defined. No bird soars too high if he soars with his own wings. Friedrich Nietzsche. To look at her, you would never suspect that Anne was in the midst of a crisis. She sat in my office, composed and resplendent in a black Tahari suit. The only sign of any agitation was her habit of coiling and uncoiling her index finger around her strand of pearls. She looked much younger than 43. As my client now for nearly 4 months, she, at first, had been at a loss to explain rationally what brought her to me. "No one ever expects a midlife crisis, Dr. Jacobsen. I certainly didn't," were the first words that Anne spoke to me. At one point in her legal career, Anne had been a dynamo, working on a team that won a major case involving suspected violations of interstate commerce laws in the dairy industry. The lead attorney acknowledged that it was her dogged efforts that helped dismantle the government's case. Anne seemed destined to make partner before she was 35, and was guaranteed the pick of the firm's highest profile and potentially most lucrative cases. Success hadn't come without a price. Those who were passed over for promotion in favor of Anne attributed her meteoric rise to favoritism, and not her razor-sharp analytical skills, her amazing intuition, and her 26-hour workdays. Once lauded as the consummate most valuable player, Anne was eventually plagued by not-so-quiet whispers about her chameleon-like ability to transform herself into whomever each partner wanted her to be. Suddenly, the qualities that had once been her most valuable assets felt like her greatest liabilities. Always someone who took every criticism to heart, Anne stopped trusting her intuition and her allies. Rather than ranging far and wide to offer colleagues help, anticipating their problems before they even identified them, she kept to a carefully circumscribed territory in order to restore her coworkers' regard for her. Her boundless interest and enthusiasm, previously characterized by being the first to volunteer to tackle the thorniest problem, now slid precipitously. She became aloof and distant. After all the problems I created by being a standout, I decided that the best way to get along was to go along and just joylessly grind my way through the day like everyone else. It seemed to be the only way that I could make working there bearable. Everyone else seemed pleased about my so-called change, but I was miserable. A few months before Anne first came to see me, I'd walked into my office one afternoon and was startled to find a man standing at the window, tugging at one of the slats in the mini-blinds and peering out at the street. He turned around and saw me. Then he took a couple of steps toward me, muttered, "How you doing, Doc?" and stalked to the bookcase lining one wall. He pulled a book off the shelf and started leafing through it. "You must be John," I said as evenly as I could. "My clients usually wait in the reception area." "Well, I saw that other woman come out, so I came on in. You don't mind, do you?" There was little to suggest that John was asking a question. John soon put back the book and took down a few others, smiling ruefully and shaking his head after examining a couple of their titles. Eventually, I came to understand that John was very nearly incapable of keeping still for longer than a few minutes at a time. In this instance, the classic stereotype of the patient lying on the couch was laughable. John was the epitome of the restless peripatetic at home and at the office. Early on, John described how he perceived others. It's like the rest of the world is moving along at 24 frames per second, normal film speed, but to me that's slow motion. Even when somebody's talking during a meeting, I swear I look at their mouths and it's like I'm advancing the tape frame by frame on my VCR. So, okay, film and videotape are two very different things, so maybe that's not the best example, but maybe it's more like the world's a blender on stir, and I'm on liquefy. John's self-editing and criticism aside, his description is apt. To someone like John, the rest of the world does seem as if it's lagging behind. From people walking too slowly on sidewalks, and those counting out exact change in a supermarket checkout line, to others arriving at a solution that seemed obvious to John minutes, days, or sometimes weeks before. Everyone else always seemed to be moving at a glacial pace. A true multitasker, John used to upset everyone at meetings because he could monitor the flow of the conversation, read a report, scan the agenda for the next item of discussion, then jump ahead or interject at seemingly inappropriate moments. I'm sick of being told to slow down. If I'm on an express train and they're on a local, why don't they switch trains and get onto mine? It's time for them to be responsible for catching up to me. Unfortunately for John, what others perceived as his uncooperative attitude eventually caught up with him. While he hadn't been fired from his job as a creative director at an advertising agency, he'd been essentially stripped of all authority. He'd been asked to stay on in a consulting capacity, but was given little real work to do. John clearly sensed what was about to happen to him, but that only made him dig in his heels more deeply on some issues and veer recklessly from one more outlandish idea to the next, wielding his considerable wit like a saber. He'd gone from being a visionary Renaissance man of the company to persona non grata in a matter of months. It wouldn't bother me so much, but before I came along, most of them thought that HTML was what you saw when some of the letters burned out in a neon hotel or motel sign. I got us a jump start into web advertising, and now everyone is reaping the benefits and claiming they were the masterminds behind the whole thing. It's like working with a bunch of Al Gores claiming they were the ones who helped develop the World Wide Web. Of course, everybody knows that Dan Quayle was the one who invented the spell checker. Giftedness denied. While John and Anne couldn't have been more different in certain respects, they do have much in common. They are both gifted adults standing poised at a crossroads. And they both initially recoiled at my suggestion that they were gifted. Like John and Anne, when many of us hear the word gifted, we almost always think two things. One, only school children are gifted. And two, since I'm not a child, I can't be gifted. These automatic responses are understandable, given what most of us have been told about bright people. But most of what we have been told is radically incorrect and enormously incomplete. Most of us think we know what giftedness is, but we're unable to describe it or define it accurately. Part of the reason for that is that we live in a culture that emphasizes products over process. We can see what gifted people produce, but we can't see the internal systems and operations that produced those products. In the previous sentence, even I had to resort to using words more suited to something manufactured mechanically than to how the brain really functions. While most people in a society would accept the definition that giftedness is as giftedness does, it is not adequate for the purposes of this book. Most definitions of giftedness include these components: initially having and using natural abilities without benefit of formal training, rapid learning, creative and productive thinking, high academic achievement, superior proficiency in one or more domains, for example, mathematics, performing arts, leadership. As you can see, the emphasis is on the cognitive components of giftedness. While the cognitive components are certainly important to consider in discussing giftedness, too often there is a piece missing. Giftedness is not merely as giftedness does, or as giftedness thinks. Instead, giftedness is as it thinks, as well as feels, senses, perceives, and does. The Gifted Adult explores the psychology and personality of gifted adults, the most under-identified group of potential achievers in our society. Regrettably, too often in our society, those who would most readily be identified as smart are most at odds with making their intelligence work for them. Quite often it works against gifted adults, preventing them from producing the kind of products that traditionally are the markers of giftedness. One possible explanation for this discrepancy is that we place a great deal of emphasis on educating gifted children. We understand that gifted children operate differently from those in the mainstream. As a result, we try to accommodate these differences among children by providing them with special programs and enrichment activities. However, even in the best school districts, these programs are often inadequate and make the fundamental mistake of using only standard measures such as IQ as a basis for admission. Programs for the talented and gifted are a relatively recent phenomenon. As a mother of 3 very different gifted children, as a former educator and advocate for gifted education, I can attest to the benefits and deficits of these programs. However, despite the varying quality of such programs and their methods of identifying students, they stand head and shoulders above earlier efforts to educate gifted children, since specialized programs simply did not exist. From first-hand experience, I know that many gifted programs consisted primarily of removing the smart kids from the classroom and giving them busy work or enlisting their aid as tutors for the slow kids. If we accept the notion that some children are gifted, then we have to account for what happens to these children when they grow up. After all, it's not as though these former children slough off their giftedness like discarded skin at the age of 16 or 18 or 21. Gifted children do grow up, and they become gifted adults. It seems like an obvious comment to make, yet little is written about giftedness and how it applies to adults. So instead of asking if gifted adults exist, we might be better served by asking questions like the following. How many gifted adults are there? What are they doing with their lives? What do we know about how they function in society? What do they have to do to be successful and fully use their abilities? These are all important questions, and it is this initial line of inquiry that led me to more fully investigate the concept of giftedness as it applies to adults. Interestingly enough, my answer to the first question about the number of gifted adults in this country demands that we radically revise our thinking about the very nature of giftedness. Today there are at least 20 million Americans who would be classified as gifted adults. That number dwarfs the estimated 3 million gifted children in our schools. So where do these gifted adults come from? They can be found in every age bracket, culture, gender, and socioeconomic stratum across the nation. They are many of us. Given these statistics, quite a number of people you know are gifted adults, and perhaps even you are a member of this not-so-exclusive group. Despite our John and Anne-like claims to the contrary, it is not the proverbial others who are truly gifted. We who are what I term the everyday geniuses in our society comprise a group that together would be equal to the size of the entire population of New York State. So-called baby boomers comprise the largest portion of the unidentified gifted adult population. The baby boom was a sharp rise in the birth rate that began after World War II and lasted for nearly 20 years. Using the crudest of statistical analyses, it is clear that with more children being born, the greater the number of potentially gifted children there would be in that boom. Since there were no programs to accommodate their needs, many of these youngsters spent their formative years adrift, a great number of them choosing to swim against the tide of societal expectation. Furthermore, when you consider that the bulk of the baby boomer generation is presently moving into, or has already moved into, midlife, the time at which many of these identity issues resurface, you can understand why I felt so compelled to write this book. Since 1991, when I began specializing in counseling gifted adults, I have become increasingly aware that a kind of cascade effect has been created by this group's collective discontent. While we are no longer taking over administration buildings or taking to the streets in protest, we are experiencing a similar kind of discomfort with maintaining our individual and collective status quo. For many of us, life has become a kind of dance to avoid the vaguely déjà vu-like feelings from early adulthood that kept tangling our feet and sent us tripping along widely varied paths. The gifted adult. Like Anne and John, the individuals who come into my office have a vague awareness that the root of their problems is far deeper than surface symptoms. They realize they are intense, complex, and driven, but they have been taught that their strong personalities are perceived as excessive, too different from the norm, and consequently wrong. In a culture that often equates different with wrong, it's inevitable that gifted adults point a critical finger toward themselves as the source of their discontent. Why can't I just be like everybody else? Shouldn't I have outgrown this kind of identity crisis by now? Why can't I shake this nagging sense of urgency? Will I ever feel satisfied? What's wrong with me? When I hear my clients say these things to me, what immediately becomes obvious is that they are in dire need of accurate information about themselves. Frequently, the very traits that make an adult gifted are the same traits that society demands they suppress. This is a book about normalizing giftedness. My purpose is to show gifted adults how they can bring their gifts to fruition by fully expressing the very qualities that are the foundation of their personality. The source of giftedness. Not surprisingly, in order to more fully understand adult giftedness, we need to turn our attention back to children. One fundamental reason why many researchers use children as their subjects in studies of giftedness is that children have not been exposed to as many environmental factors as adolescents or adults. Consequently, researchers can see the nature side of the nature-nurture debate in a more pristine state. What studies have shown is that gifted children perceive the world in fundamentally different ways than other children. It is as if their sensory apparatus is more finely tuned to detect input that others either filter out or ignore. This heightened receptivity is present from the earliest stages of development and later gives rise to the urge to perfect. Because gifted children perceive in ways that are different in kind and degree than others, their heightened receptivity makes them hot receptors, capable of automatically detecting even the slightest change in their external environment. They also possess an innate sense of how things should be, and not just how they are. In other words, They have an innate urge to perfect. We often see these two traits displayed in children who aren't satisfied with things until they are just so. I call these two underlying components of giftedness, heightened receptivity and the urge to perfect, first nature traits. We often talk about how things become second nature to us over a period of time. In this case, the gifted don't experience any real adjustment period. They are hardwired from the very start with these two traits. For that reason, first nature is a convenient shorthand to describe them. It is the first nature traits that give rise to the intensity, complexity, and drive that are the more visible characteristics of giftedness. The only way to manifest what is the norm for someone with such a highly sensitive sensory apparatus and vision of how things ought to be in a world that seems radically out of sync, think of John's colleagues' slow-motion mouths, is to be intense, complex, and driven. As Abraham Maslow pointed out, we are all driven by the urge to meet our needs. What if one of our most fundamental needs is to have things be just so? What do we do if our precise sense of proportion sets off an alarm in our heads when the figures we've drawn are slightly skewed? We stop, assess, and start over, again and again until we get it right. And we don't do this so much by choice, but because of a mandate from somewhere both inside and outside of ourselves. Unless you've experienced this urge to perfect and are a hot receptor yourself, it is difficult to make clear how fundamentally a part of a gifted person's core personality these first nature traits are, and how much they affect their overall development. One way to think about first nature traits is to compare them to hand preference. Unless we've suffered some accident that has rendered our dominant hand useless, we don't much think about the subject. Yet, like the first nature of the gifted, our handedness has a major influence on how we negotiate our way in the world. And like those well-intentioned teachers and family members who once forced left-handers to abandon the use of the naturally dominant hand, gifted adults often experience the same kind of treatment. Most gifted people are not able to articulate that it is their first nature that makes them extraordinarily aware, compels them to make things just so, or makes them so dissatisfied when things are not that way. Consequently, when these underlying formative personality traits express themselves, other people not only usually misinterpret the message, but may sometimes fantasize about getting rid of the messenger as well. Like so many aspects of human misbehavior, we have to separate the act from the actor. In John's and Anne's cases, they weren't acting badly. They were enacting a fundamental aspect of their personality. I hope to provide a bridge between this society's expectations of how we ought to behave and the gifted personality, so that we can understand that it is the desire of the gifted person to live authentically and not suppress the first nature traits that produce what some consider aberrant behavior. In fact, I would agree that Anne's and John's behaviors were somewhat aberrant. However, it is more important for us to understand that they were behaving aberrantly in terms of their own first nature, rather than acknowledge their supposed transgressions against society's norms. In the course of working with gifted adults over the years, I've discovered that they've learned that they can't express their first nature traits without censure. As a result, they modify their behavior in one of two ways, by either collapsing it or exaggerating it. Let's take a closer look at John and Anne to see how they are the perfect examples of this forced accommodation that gifted adults make, and the ways in which intensity, complexity, and drive function. On one hand, Anne's experiences and reactions typify the collapsed response when one's intensity, complexity, and drive are challenged. She lowered her standards to conform and began to distrust herself and her intuition. Over the years, she developed the habit of being too trusting and was too easily wounded as a result. She had always been consumed by the projects she undertook, and when she wasn't rewarded in proportion to her efforts, she became indifferent, adopting a fatalistic view of her mistakes. On the other hand, John is the perfect example of exaggerated intensity, complexity, and drive. His high energy posed a threat to others when he dominated conversations, used words as weapons, and posed potentially embarrassing questions. John was as raw and overstimulated as they come, a provocateur who openly defied authority and ducked responsibility for his choices. In addition to the umbrella traits of intensity, complexity, and drive, Anne, John, and other gifted adults have a penchant for what I call complex thinking, as well as sensory and emotional sensitivity, deep empathy, excitability, perceptivity, and goal-oriented motivation. The concept of giftedness expanded. Since I have worked with a wide range of gifted individuals in a variety of settings, I've dared to take the risk of offering this new platform for the discussion of adult giftedness. After counseling hundreds of gifted people, I was increasingly alarmed to see how confused they are by their unexplained inner conflicts, which only grow stronger over the years. Although most of them appear to be navigating life with considerable success, the inner story is one of lost identity. Repeatedly, I have been struck by their lack of freedom to express themselves and to fulfill their potential. And on a much larger scale, I am dismayed by the precious commodity our society loses when our most creative people are overwrought with self-doubt and self-sabotage. More important, no one has offered a suitable roadmap for how gifted adults may live out the promise of their high potential, fit in and have successful relationships, and manage themselves so that their traits are truly assets instead of liabilities. This means that how we conceptualize giftedness has to be expanded to include two concepts: everyday genius and evolutionary intelligence. These two concepts fundamentally alter our conception of giftedness and offer a new paradigm, which is a risky venture. I owe a debt of gratitude to others in the field upon whose work I have built, such as Leanne Bell, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, Kazimierz Dabrowski, Howard Gardner, Lita Hollingworth, Carl Gustav Jung, Lawrence Kohlberg, Deirdre Lovecki, Alice Miller, Michael Pichowski, Jane Pierto, Joseph Renzulli, Mary Rocamora, Anne-Marie Roper, Martin Seligman, Linda Krieger-Silverman, Robert Sternberg, and James T. Webb. I hope that what I present in this book will serve as a catalyst to others so that we can be certain that one of our most valuable resources, the everyday geniuses in our midst, are free to fully contribute to our collective advancement. For the past 20 years, Howard Gardner has been doing groundbreaking research into intelligence. His work at Harvard University on Project Zero has fundamentally changed the way in which many approach the study of intelligence. His theory of multiple intelligences suggests that rather than being a single discrete entity, intelligence is composed of various domains. The 8 areas, or types of intelligence that he identifies are linguistic, logical-mathematical, spatial, musical, kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalist. His work has led us away from seeking answers to the question of how smart someone is, and toward a consideration of the ways in which someone is smart. Everyone possesses each of the 8 components of multiple intelligence to some degree. However, as we know...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?